Something changed the moment you finally stopped chasing what your heart had been begging to understand. You may not have seen it happen, and you may never have imagined that one quiet decision could reach someone standing miles away, staring at their own life with tears gathering in their eyes. But in this fictional story of love, timing, and divine-like guidance, that is exactly where our journey begins. Because your soulmate had been waiting for a sign, not a dramatic declaration, not a perfect message, not some impossible miracle. They were waiting to see whether you would finally choose yourself. And you did. That was the part they never expected. For so long, they had carried a private question that they rarely admitted, even to themselves: what if I matter to them less than they matter to me? It had followed them through ordinary mornings and sleepless nights. They could laugh with friends, finish their responsibilities, answer messages, and pretend everything was normal, yet somewhere beneath all of it lived a quiet uncertainty. Then, one ordinary day, something reached them. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't your name appearing dramatically across a screen. It was something much smaller. You simply stopped doing the thing you had always done. You stopped trying to prove your worth. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than every explanation you had ever given. Imagine your soulmate sitting alone in a softly lit room that evening. Outside the window, the world continues without noticing anything unusual. Cars move along the street. Someone laughs in the distance. A phone vibrates against a wooden table and then goes quiet. They pick it up. They check the screen. Nothing from you. And for the first time, instead of feeling rejected, they feel something they haven't felt in a long time. Relief. But why would your absence make them feel relieved? Because they suddenly realized something painful. They had become accustomed to receiving your love without fully understanding the courage it required from you to keep giving it. You had been the one reaching across the distance. You had been the one wondering whether the silence meant something. You had been the one replaying conversations, examining every word, searching for hidden meaning in every pause. And now you had done something completely different. You had released the need to control the outcome. That decision shook something loose inside them. At first, they didn't know what to call it. Then came the memory. They remembered a moment between you that seemed insignificant at the time. Maybe it was a conversation in a hallway. Maybe it was a late-night phone call. Maybe it was only a glance that lasted a second longer than it should have. They remembered the way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention. And suddenly that memory didn't feel like the past. It felt like a question. What did I do with something that precious? That thought followed them into the next morning. They woke earlier than usual, before the room had completely brightened. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains, drawing thin lines across the floor. Their first instinct was to reach for their phone. They stopped. Their hand hovered above it. And then they whispered something they had never been brave enough to say aloud. I think they really let go. The words frightened them. But underneath the fear was another feeling. Hope. Because if you had truly stopped chasing them, then perhaps they finally had the space to recognize what they had been running from. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Your soulmate had not been ignoring you because they didn't care. They had been holding themselves back because caring had become too complicated. There was something they hadn't told you. Something connected to the reason they kept hesitating whenever the relationship seemed close to becoming real. They were afraid that if they stepped toward you and failed, they would lose you completely. So they chose distance. They told themselves they were protecting both of you. But distance has a strange way of exposing the truth. The farther they moved away, the more clearly they could feel what your presence had meant. They missed the little things. The way you remembered details other people forgot. The way you could tell something was wrong without demanding an explanation. The way you made ordinary moments feel important. But most of all, they missed the version of themselves that appeared when they were around you. That was the part they couldn't explain. And then you made your decision. You didn't send another message. You didn't create another reason to cross paths. You didn't ask for reassurance. You didn't punish them either. You simply continued living. You woke up. You worked. You laughed again. You made plans that didn't depend on whether they came back. You began putting pieces of your own life back where they belonged. And somewhere, without your knowledge, your soulmate noticed. Maybe through a small change in your behavior. Maybe through something someone casually mentioned. Maybe through a photograph they weren't expecting to see. Whatever the reason, they suddenly understood that your life had not ended when the connection became uncertain. You were moving forward. And instead of making them angry, it made them proud. That surprised them most of all. They smiled. Actually smiled. Then their eyes filled with tears. Because they realized you had done the one thing they had secretly hoped you would someday learn to do. You had chosen peace over pursuit. And that changed the way they saw you. Before, they had wondered whether you would always be there. Now they wondered whether they had waited too long. That question became impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, they found themselves walking past a place connected to you. Perhaps it was a cafe where you once sat together. Perhaps it was a quiet street where you shared a conversation neither of you ever forgot. They stopped. For several seconds, they simply stood there. Then came a memory they had buried. You had once looked at them and said something simple. You don't have to be perfect with me. Just be honest. At the time, they had smiled and changed the subject. Now those words felt different. Because honesty was exactly what they had avoided. They pulled out their phone. Opened your conversation. Scrolled upward. And there it was. The last message. The one they had never properly answered. Their thumb rested over the screen. They began typing. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that too. They finally wrote 3 words. I miss you. They stared at them. Then they locked the phone. Not because they didn't want to send it. Because suddenly they realized that sending those words wasn't enough. If they came back, they couldn't come back with half a heart. They couldn't return simply because loneliness had become uncomfortable. They couldn't ask you to reopen a door they had repeatedly left standing in the cold. They needed to tell you the truth. And the truth was much bigger than, I miss you. There was something they had discovered about you while you were apart. Something that made their happiness rise unexpectedly when they heard that you were doing well. Something that made them stop blaming circumstances. Something that made them understand why every attempt to forget you had failed. That evening, they received a piece of information about you. It was ordinary on the surface. Someone mentioned that you had finally done something you had been afraid to do. You had made a choice for your future without waiting for their approval. You had stepped into a new chapter. And when your soulmate heard it, they didn't feel abandoned. They felt overwhelmed with happiness. Because they finally understood. You weren't walking away from love. You were walking toward the person you were supposed to become. And that realization broke something open inside them. They sat down, covered their face with both hands, and laughed through their tears. "That's it," they whispered. "That's what I needed to see." But they still hadn't told you the most important part. Because the decision you made wasn't merely something they admired. It had forced them to confront a truth about themselves they had been avoiding for far too long. They opened their phone again. This time, they didn't type, "I miss you." They didn't type, "Can we talk?" They began writing the message they had rehearsed in their mind 100 times but never had the courage to send. And just before their finger touched the screen, they stopped. Their expression changed. Because they remembered one final thing. A secret. A moment from the past that you knew nothing about. A moment when they had already made a decision about you long before you ever realized they were watching, long before the distance, long before the silence. Their eyes filled again. They whispered your name. And then they opened the hidden folder on their phone. Inside was something they had kept for months. Something connected to you. Something they had never deleted. And when they finally looked at it again, they understood why your recent decision had affected them so deeply. Because what they had been holding onto all this time was not merely a memory. It was evidence. Evidence that, even when they were pretending to move on, a part of them had never actually left. They stared at the screen for several seconds. Then, with trembling hands, they made a choice. This time, they weren't going to wait for another sign. They weren't going to hide behind uncertainty. They weren't going to ask the universe for another excuse. They were going to tell you what happened that day. The day everything changed. The day they first realized they could lose you. And the message they were about to send began with a sentence you would never expect to receive from them. "I need to tell you why I never walked away as completely as you thought I did." The message remained unsent for almost a full minute. Not because they had changed their mind. Because suddenly the truth felt heavier than silence. Their breathing slowed as they looked at those words glowing against the dark screen. Every excuse they had ever used seemed to collapse at once. There would be no clever way to explain what they had done. No sentence could make the waiting disappear. No apology could erase every moment when you had wondered whether you were imagining the connection. So they did something they had avoided for months. They stopped trying to make themselves look innocent. Their fingers moved across the screen. "I need to tell you what happened that day." And then they began. Months earlier, there had been a moment when they were standing with someone who knew them well enough to recognize when they were lying. That person had asked a simple question. Why don't you just tell them how you feel? Your soulmate had laughed. They had looked away. And then they had answered with the excuse they had repeated so many times that they almost believed it. Because the timing isn't right. But the person beside them hadn't accepted it. They had quietly replied, or maybe you're afraid they'll say yes. That sentence had stayed with them. Because it struck deeper than rejection ever could. They weren't terrified that you would turn them away. They were terrified that you wouldn't. They were afraid that if you truly welcomed them into your life, they would have no place left to hide from their own insecurities. And that was the secret they had never been able to explain. They had spent years becoming good at appearing strong. Good at walking away first. Good at pretending they needed nothing. Good at turning vulnerable conversations into jokes. But you had noticed. You always noticed. That was why being around you felt dangerous in a completely different way. You saw past the version of them everyone else knew. You noticed the hesitation before they answered difficult questions. You heard the change in their voice when something mattered too much. You could tell when their smile was real and when it was simply armor. And instead of using those weaknesses against them, you treated them gently. That frightened them more than anything. Because kindness made it impossible to pretend. As they typed, they remembered another evening. You had been sitting across from them while rain tapped against the windows. The room had been warm, but neither of you had spoken for several minutes. You had asked, "What are you afraid of?" They had smiled and said, "Nothing." You had looked at them for a moment. Then you said, "That's not true." They had laughed. You had laughed too. But they remembered the exact way you looked at them afterward. Not judgment. Recognition. You knew. Even then, some part of you understood that their distance wasn't about a lack of feeling. It was about fear. And now, after all this time, your soulmate finally understood something equally important. You had been carrying your own fear too. You had simply learned to stop letting it make your decisions. That was why your recent choice had affected them so profoundly. You hadn't demanded certainty. You had created it for yourself. You had stopped standing outside a locked door waiting for someone else to decide whether you were worthy of entering. You had built your own door. And somehow, that made them want to walk toward you rather than away. Their message continued. There was something I saw that day. They paused. This was the part they had never told anyone. They remembered seeing you from a distance when you thought nobody was watching. You weren't looking for them. You weren't waiting. You were talking to someone, smiling naturally, completely unaware that your soulmate was nearby. And something inside them broke open. Not because you looked happy without them. Because you looked like yourself again. They suddenly realized how much of your light they had watched dim while you were trying to understand their silence. That realization carried a painful question. How many beautiful moments did they miss because they were waiting for me? They couldn't answer. So they made themselves a promise. If they ever came back into your life, they would never again ask you to shrink your world to make room for their uncertainty. But there was another problem. They didn't know whether you would still want them. That question became unbearable. For the first time, they understood that love wasn't simply about wanting someone. It was about becoming someone capable of receiving what that person offered. And they knew they still had work to do. So instead of sending the message immediately, they left the phone on the table and walked outside. The night air was cool. Streetlights reflected across the pavement. They walked without choosing a destination, letting their thoughts become quieter with every step. Then their phone rang. It was someone they hadn't spoken to in weeks. Someone who knew enough about the situation to understand why the call mattered. They answered. There was silence on the other end. Then came 4 words. They're doing really well. Your soulmate stopped walking. Their heart tightened. Who told you that? The answer came calmly. Someone who saw them recently. They listened. You were apparently making changes. Not dramatic ones. The kind that happen quietly when someone has finally decided their future deserves attention. You were making plans. You were becoming more independent. You were taking opportunities you had once hesitated over. You were no longer organizing your life around an unanswered question. And the person on the phone said something that changed the entire conversation. They don't seem angry anymore. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence hurt more than anger would have. Because anger would have meant you were still emotionally tied to what happened. Peace meant something else. Peace meant you might truly be moving beyond it. They ended the call and stood beneath a street lamp, staring at the empty road. For months, they had assumed they had time. Now they understood that time doesn't announce when it is about to close a chapter. And suddenly, their happiness became mixed with urgency. Not desperation. Not panic. Something more mature. A recognition that if they wanted another chance, they couldn't simply wait for fate to make everything convenient. They had to become honest. They turned around and walked home. This time, they knew exactly what they needed to say. When they reached their room, they opened the hidden folder again. There was a photograph inside. Not a photograph of you. A photograph of something you had given them. Something so ordinary that nobody else would have understood its importance. To anyone else, it would have looked meaningless. To them, it represented the exact moment they realized their feelings were deeper than they had admitted. They had kept it through every attempt to move forward. Every new distraction. Every conversation where they insisted they were fine. Every night they told themselves that the past belonged in the past. They had never deleted it. Because somewhere inside, they knew. They weren't preserving an object. They were preserving a possibility. Their eyes became wet as they finally admitted what that possibility meant. They didn't simply want you back. They wanted the chance to meet you again as a better version of themselves. That distinction mattered. Because they weren't coming to ask you to rescue them from loneliness. They were coming because they had finally understood the value of what they once treated casually. And then they remembered the thing you had done recently. The decision that had changed everything. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even something directly related to romance. You had forgiven yourself. That was it. You had stopped punishing yourself for what you couldn't control. You had stopped asking whether you should have been more patient, more understanding, more available, more perfect. You finally accepted that you had loved as honestly as you knew how. And that acceptance changed the entire story. Because when your soulmate heard about it, they realized something painful. They had been waiting for you to prove that you still cared. But you had been waiting for yourself to remember that you mattered too. That realization left them overwhelmed. They sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in both hands. A tear fell onto the screen. They wiped it away. Then they began typing again. This time, there was no hesitation. I owe you the truth. They told you about the fear. They told you about the moment someone confronted them. They told you why they had kept their distance. They admitted that their silence had never been as simple as it appeared. Then they reached the sentence that terrified them most. I was afraid that if I let you love me completely, you'd eventually discover that I didn't think I deserved it. They stopped. Read it again. And pressed send. For several seconds, nothing happened. The message showed as delivered. Their heart began pounding. They put the phone face down. Then picked it up again. Still nothing. Another minute passed. Then another. They walked toward the window. The city seemed unusually quiet. And just as they were beginning to believe they had made a terrible mistake, the screen lit up. Your name appeared. Their entire body went still. There was a reply. Only one sentence. They read it once. Then again. And a third time. Their eyes widened. Because you hadn't responded with anger. You hadn't asked for an explanation. You hadn't said that they were too late. You had written something that revealed you had been carrying your own secret all along. The sentence began. I knew you were afraid, but I never knew that the reason was. They couldn't finish reading. Their hands started shaking. Because beneath your words was something they had never expected to hear. Something that could change the meaning of everything that happened between you. And when they finally opened the rest of your message, they discovered that the decision you had made, the one that had filled them with such overwhelming happiness, was connected to a truth neither of you had been ready to face. A truth involving the future you once imagined together. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether your soulmate would come back. The question was whether they would be brave enough to tell you what they had discovered before you made your next move. Because you had already made yours. And you were closer to leaving the old chapter behind than they ever realized. For a few seconds, your soulmate could only stare at your message. The room seemed to become completely still. They read the sentence again, slowly this time. I knew you were afraid, but I never knew that the reason was. They continued. Because you thought you would eventually disappoint me. Their eyes closed. A long breath escaped their chest. So that was it. All those months of hesitation had been built around a fear neither of you had fully named. They had believed they were protecting you from their imperfections. You had believed their distance meant you were not enough. Two people had been standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding, each silently carrying pain the other person could have helped heal. And suddenly, everything looked different. You weren't waiting for a perfect person. You were waiting for an honest one. That distinction changed everything. Your soulmate sat down and let the tears come. Not tears of heartbreak this time. Tears of release. They realized how much energy they had spent trying to become someone who would never make a mistake, when all you had ever wanted was someone willing to tell the truth when mistakes happened. Then another part of your message appeared. I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean holding them in place while you figure yourself out. They read that line twice. Then came the sentence that made their hands tremble. That is why I made the choice I made. Your soulmate looked toward the window. For the first time, they understood what you had done. You had not chosen another person. You had not erased them from your heart. You had chosen your own future. You had accepted an opportunity you had once postponed because you were afraid that moving forward would somehow mean abandoning the possibility of the two of you. But you finally realized something important. If a connection was real enough to survive, it should not require you to stop living. So you said yes to your own life. And that was the decision that overwhelmed your soulmate with happiness. Because they finally saw you becoming exactly who they had always admired. Not someone waiting beside a door. Someone walking through an open one. They smiled through their tears. Then they whispered, almost as though speaking to an empty room, I'm proud of you. But the story wasn't finished. Your soulmate still had one choice to make. They could admire your courage from a distance and allow the moment to pass. Or they could finally step forward without demanding anything from you. They picked up their phone. This time, the message was simple. I don't want you to stop moving forward for me. I want to know if there's still a place in your life where we can walk forward together. They stared at the words. Then sent them. There was no manipulation in the message. No pressure. No promise that everything would magically become easy. Just honesty. And somehow, that made the silence afterward feel different. You weren't being asked to rescue the relationship. You were being given the freedom to choose. That freedom was exactly what made the next moment so beautiful. Your reply arrived. I don't need you to promise me forever tonight. They swallowed. The next line appeared. I just need you to stop hiding from what is true. They smiled. Because that was the answer they had needed all along. Not certainty. Not perfection. Courage. They called you. For several seconds, neither of you spoke. There was only the quiet sound of breathing through the phone. Then your soulmate finally said, I'm sorry. You didn't immediately respond. They continued. Not because I didn't care. Because I cared, and I was too afraid of what caring would require from me. Your voice was quiet when you answered. I know. 2 words. But they carried the weight of months. They talked for a long time. Not like 2 people trying to recreate the past. Like 2 people finally meeting each other honestly. They spoke about the moments that had hurt. The moments that had been misunderstood. The opportunities they had both missed. The fears they had hidden. And eventually, they laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrives after a long period of emotional tension and reminds you that love doesn't always have to feel heavy. Your soulmate told you about the photograph they had kept. They told you why it mattered. They admitted that they had looked at it during moments when they claimed they were completely over everything. You laughed softly. Then you asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" There was a pause. "Because I thought telling you would give you hope." "And now?" Your soulmate smiled. "Now I think honesty is more important than protecting myself from the possibility of hope." Neither of you knew exactly what the future would look like. And strangely, that uncertainty no longer felt frightening. It felt honest. There would be conversations still to have. Trust would need time. Old habits would need patience. Some wounds would not disappear simply because two people finally admitted they cared. But something essential had changed. You were no longer trying to force an ending. They were no longer running from a beginning. And perhaps that was the real meaning behind everything that had happened. The biggest change had never been the message. It had never been the photograph. It had never been the distance. It had been the moment you finally chose yourself without closing your heart. That decision gave your soulmate something they had never experienced with you before. The freedom to choose you without being chased. And when they understood that, happiness overwhelmed them. Because they realized they didn't have to return because you were waiting. They could return because they were ready. That difference made their love feel lighter. A few days later, they met again. There was no dramatic music. No perfect sunset. No impossible coincidence. Just two people standing across from each other in an ordinary place. For a moment, neither moved. Then your soulmate smiled. You smiled back. And somehow, all the words that had once seemed impossible became simple. They walked toward you. "I don't know what happens next," they said. You answered, "Neither do I." They laughed. Then they said, "But I want to find out." And this time, there was no hesitation. You walked together. Not because some invisible force had guaranteed that nothing would ever go wrong. Not because the past had magically disappeared. But because both of you had learned something the hard way. Love cannot grow where fear is constantly making the decisions. It needs honesty. It needs freedom. It needs two people who can say, "I choose you," without saying, "I need you to complete me." And that was why your soulmate's happiness had become so overwhelming. They weren't celebrating because you had finally come back to them. They were celebrating because you had finally come back to yourself. And by doing that, you had made room for something healthier to begin. So if there is one thing this fictional story leaves with you, let it be this. Never believe that choosing yourself means you have stopped believing in love. Sometimes choosing yourself is the very thing that teaches love how to find you differently. Sometimes the chapter you think is ending is simply changing its language. Sometimes silence isn't the final answer. Sometimes it is the space where two people finally learn what they were too afraid to say. And sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do for someone you love is stop chasing them long enough for both of you to discover whether they are willing to walk beside you freely. You don't have to force what is meant to unfold. You don't have to abandon your dreams while waiting for another person's decision. You don't have to make yourself smaller to keep a connection alive. Keep becoming. Keep growing. Keep choosing peace. And if someone is meant to meet you in that new chapter, let them meet the real you there, not the version of you who was exhausted from waiting, but the version who finally remembered their own worth. May your heart be given patience when answers take time. May you have wisdom when emotions become confusing. May you recognize the difference between love and attachment, between hope and waiting, between forgiveness and forgetting yourself. May the people who enter your life bring honesty instead of uncertainty, courage instead of games, and peace instead of constant doubt. And may you never have to beg someone to recognize the value of your heart. May you have the strength to release what cannot meet you with the same sincerity you offer. May you have the grace to welcome what arrives with genuine intention. And wherever your own story is leading, may the next chapter bring you closer to peace, purpose, and the kind of love that allows you to remain completely yourself. Remember this final truth from our story. You didn't lose yourself to find love. You found yourself, and that changed the way love could find you. So if this fictional story spoke to something quietly living inside your heart, stay with that feeling for a moment. Don't rush past it. Take what gives you hope, leave what doesn't, and carry the reminder that your future does not have to be controlled by your past. And if you want more emotional, cinematic stories like this, subscribe to the channel, stay connected, and come back for the next story. Because sometimes the message you need isn't about who is coming back. Sometimes it's about who you are becoming while you wait. And that person may be the most beautiful surprise of all.